Deirdre Brock.
Hey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to start by reading a quote from journalist Francis Ryan. When the most vulnerable citizens line is used by well-meaning voices, there's a secret second sentence that's rarely uttered. Disabled people, truth be told, do not need to be vulnerable. Contrary to the myth sold by years of austerity, to be afraid, desperate or isolated is not a normal state of affairs for people with disabilities. Vulnerability comes when politicians choose to pull the support disabled people need in order to live dignified, fulfilling, independent lives, knowing full well the misery it will cause. The clarity of her writing is matched by the clarity of her thought. We have failed people who have disabilities. Our attitude seems to be that disabled people only need to get up, be washed and dressed and fed, and nothing else matters. Nothing about quality of life, social interaction, cultural activities, or anything else that makes us human, just the basics of survival. And even there, we are failing them. Leonard Cheshire last year produced research that showed that half of the disabled adults in the UK who need social care are living without any help at all, leaving them isolated, trapped at home and unable to be part of society. That is our fault. Now, I will avoid reciting a list of cases of utter desperation that come to my surgery on a regular basis, and I'm sure that every member here can reel off with little effort a dozen cases that illustrate the damage to individuals caused by the government's policies, how austerity has stripped away dignity, and how an uncaring lead from Whitehall has had uncaring followers in its wake. I have no doubt, I have no doubt that the Minister could add to that lament if she was so minded. It is a river of human misery that should shame the government and every legislator who stands in this chamber, but it doesn't. Instead, the atmosphere of persecution creates fear and distrust, leaving people isolated and alone, a form of psychological damage, which may be even more cruel than the physical damage. Yes.
Does she recognise we have kind of noted World Mental Health Day this week, that one of the biggest contributors to stress and mental ill health is actually poverty and the desperation these changes are bringing about?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and again that is something we hear just too much of in our surgeries in these past years. And unfortunately there is no sign of it ending. 2 of the 3 disability premiums that were in employment support allowance are missing from universal credit, so severely disabled people could potentially lose £78.35 per week from their income. That is about £340 per month, Madam Deputy Speaker. And research done by the Citizens Advice Bureau in East Lothian showed that disabled recipients of universal credit will lose up to 1/5 of their income. Now, against that background, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities reported in August on the progress that the UK has made towards fulfilling its obligations under the Convention. Now, it's fair to say that the committee was not complimentary to the UK government. It praised the Scottish Government and gave some praise to the Welsh Government, but it didn't feel able to say much in favour of the UK Government's efforts. And I really hope the Minister will be able to reassure us that there will be better news in future reports. The United Nations criticised the austerity fetish, condemned the cuts to funding offered to people with disabilities for independent living, and called on the government to backtrack. The tally of recommendations for the UK from the committee exceeded 80 and covered a huge range of areas where we have simply failed people with disabilities, where Parliament has not protected them and where government has assaulted them. And it is, as the chairperson of the UN committee said, a human catastrophe, and that the government has totally neglected people with disabilities. Now, at the end of last year, the same UN committee said that UK government policies and cuts amounted to systematic violations of the rights of people with disabilities. And the government response appears to have rested on saying the committee misunderstood. and that it was improving and building on the support available to disabled people. And I hope the Minister will offer us a little more today. The Government has not acted on the previous report from the committee. I hope we can get some commitment to act on this one. I'm not looking for an answer to every point in the committee's report. I'm sure there's a team of civil servants working on that already, and it will come in due course. But an indication from the Minister about whether she and the Department intend to press ahead with addressing the concerns raised by the UN. The UK is going backwards in far too many critical rights of people with disabilities, and I think that the concluding observations contained probably about the highest number of recommendations from the committee for any state so far. Now, I appreciate that it is a bit difficult to turn a government around to point in a different direction, especially when so many senior members of that government seem to have other things on their minds. But will she give a commitment at least that she will work towards addressing all of the recommendations made by the committee? I hope she'll be able to give such a commitment, and that she will apply some honest endeavour to get her government colleagues to pay some attention to these issues. Can she give us the commitment that she will seek to address each and every one of the recommendations? Will she also give us the commitment that she will include deaf and disabled people's organisations in the work to address those recommendations? I mean fully, not just a quick consultation and then carry on regardless. Will she have the DDPOs in the room, part of the process, a fully functioning part of her efforts as recommended by paragraph 53 of the report?
Yes. My honourable friend is right to mention the experience of deaf people within the process of DLE and PIP. Action for Hearing Loss, based in my constituency in Glasgow Central, found that when they set up a welfare rights offer for deaf people, that prior to that many deaf people were getting absolutely no support whatsoever because they couldn't access the online service nor could they access the phone service, so they got nothing.
That is a very important and rather sad point that my honourable friend makes. I understand the definition of DDPO to be one where the management committee or board has at least 75% of representation from deaf and disabled people, at least 50% of their paid staff team are deaf and disabled people, and with representation at all levels of the organisation, and they provide services for or work on behalf of deaf and disabled people. Now, disability charities are not necessarily DPPOs, and DPPOs are not necessarily all geared up to work easily with government. But will she give the commitment to reach out to them and invite them to the table? That is, after all, one of the recommendations. I'm sure it hasn't escaped Whitehall's notice either that there is a recommendation in there that organisations representing persons with disabilities should be adequately funded. Perhaps that could be addressed early to ensure that the DPPOs can adequately resource their involvement in the government's planning. Now, as I said, I don't intend to cover every recommendation. There simply isn't the time today, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it might be worth looking at paragraph 25, which indicates that the government should improve accessibility standards. Now, I remind the Minister that this is Guide Dog Week and ask whether she might take into account the needs of guide dog users who would like to see pavement parking banned and audio announcements on buses to let them know where they are. They'd also like to have disability equality training provided to public transport providers, including taxi drivers and minicab drivers, along the lines of the training being introduced by the Scottish Government. Will any of that be possible?
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yes.
Honourable friend for giving way. She's making a very powerful speech, and at the moment she's emphasising the importance of accessibility rights. Is she aware that the former Paralympian Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson has said that leaving the European Union will prevent British people with disabilities from benefiting from upcoming EU legislation on accessibility? And does she agree with me that EU law has often filled in the gaps in disability protections in the United Kingdom, and therefore we need to be conscious of that?
My honourable friend raises some excellent points there, and it's certainly an issue of great concern to a great number of organisations that deal with and on behalf of disabled people. The committee also recommends creating a proper employment programme for people with disabilities to create decent work opportunities on equal pay scales. Can she tell us that this is going to happen and assure us that the government does not intend to change the minimum wage legislation in a way which will disadvantage people with disabilities? Will she clarify the government's position on maintaining the same minimum wage for people with disabilities as for other people? I wish there was time to go through all these recommendations, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish there was time to address each and every one of these points, and I wish there was time to get to the bottom of each of the points raised in this report. I feel, however, that there may be more benefit in allowing the Minister plenty of time to answer the points raised, and we can, of course, revisit the issues at a later date. Can I therefore make a few final points and ask a few final questions that I hope she will be able to answer for us? These few are, I think, the most important of all, and I would be very grateful if the Minister would give them special attention. Paragraph 59 of the report calls for the Personal Independence Payment Amendment regulations of this year to be repealed. Will she commit the government to that?
Honourable Friend, give way on that one.
Yes.
Honourable Friend, I congratulate her for securing this very important debate, and I know she's a very assiduous constituency MP. Like me, does she find that constituency surgeries, a number of constituents who had a lifetime award for disability living allowance and have now been transitioned to PIP, go for an assessment and are suddenly found fit to work?
Yes. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are situations that are all too common to all of us as constituency MPs. And I hope the Minister is listening closely to some of these examples and can take action. Yes, of course.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and congratulate her on the fulsome debate she's doing. Will the member agree with me that the UN report gave hope to a lot of disabled people who felt they were simply not being listened to, and by not coming to the House to give a full statement, the government's lost an opportunity to show it's listening to the needs of disabled people?
I would absolutely agree, and that is the reason why I decided to put in for this debate myself, because I feel it's such an important report. It demands an answer from the Minister as to all of the recommendations. Obviously our time is limited today, but hopefully there will be an opportunity in the future for more of these recommendations to be addressed. The same paragraph, that paragraph 59, calls for a cumulative, I think this is so important, a cumulative impact assessment of all the changes to support for people with disabilities. Now, will she commit to doing that? It also calls for a review of the conditionality and sanction regimes and for the government to tackle the negative consequences of the regimes. Will she commit to that? It also calls for a support framework that recognises the many additional costs that come with disabilities. Will she commit to that? Now, I appreciate that the...
Order.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I appreciate that the Minister is in a government where austerity has become a fixation and elevated to some high regard approaching a theology. And I can appreciate that some of her ministerial colleagues have, at times, shown what could only be described as a callous disregard for the welfare of people with disabilities. But I am prepared to accept that she stands now at the dispatch box in good faith. Will she undertake to members of Parliament, and more importantly to our constituents, to seek a fair deal for people with disabilities, a deal which recognises the additional costs and the additional strains on life which come with those disabilities? Can I return to constituents who have asked and reply that the Minister with responsibility for their welfare is seeking to fulfil the obligations laid upon her by the Convention, and can I tell them that she wants them to be part of the process? What commitments will she give today?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for Edinburgh North and Leith for securing this debate and colleagues who have contributed. She raises a number of points which I will go through in detail. Largely on the domestic agenda, and we should also note that the EHRC have also raised a number of issues in the wake of the report. All of those issues that the Honourable Lady and they raise are important and legitimate ones to raise, and I will take them each in turn. But I also do want to address separately the UN process and why its credibility is so important. and important to me personally, in particular, as the Honourable Lady has placed great weight on that, and me personally in her speech. We are committed to the Convention and to the progressive realisation of the rights for disabled people that it sets out. The UK supported the development of the Convention and was one of the first countries to sign it and to ratify it. We are one of the few nations that have also ratified the Convention's optional protocol, which allows for individual complaints to be raised and permits the UN Committee to investigate alleged violations of the Convention. It is for this reason that it would be quite wrong to conclude that time spent on a particular nation in scrutiny is an indication of their standing in the world on these matters. The fact is that we allow the UN to do this. We enable our nation's record to be examined and the full participation in that by civil society, and I think that is a credit to the UK, and it is an example I hope other nations will follow. And it is a sign of our commitment to this agenda. To pretend otherwise undermines the UN's processes, and I would argue its core aims, in particular promoting social progress and human rights. And globally, it is disabled people who have often been the last to have those aims focused on them. They are the most discriminated against and face the greatest obstacles to reaching their full potential. I shall.
Minister, for giving way. Obviously, we discussed a previous case where a gentleman with complex PTSD in my constituency was treated really quite poorly. This is one of the areas where people are really suffering under PIP, and it's simply by design. So is that something that she will commit to look at? Because we talk about parity of esteem, but it doesn't exist in PIP.
Absolutely.
So if I can just digress to answer that point, I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. In the case that the Honourable Lady raised from memory on the floor of this House, she alleged some unacceptable behaviour by one of our call assistants. In any case that any honourable member raises with me, I'll investigate that fully. And I obtained a transcript of the conversation, and it was absolutely not the case that what was alleged to have occurred did. Now, I do not criticise in any way the Honourable Lady because she had this third hand, and she was quite right to raise the concerns that she did. But where honourable members raise issues with me as the Minister or any of the DWP team, we will investigate them fully, and any unacceptable behaviour will be dealt with.
Does the Minister not recognise that with the obsession with mobility within PIP, it does not recognise mental health? It gives far too much weight only to those with a physical disability, and therefore there simply isn't parity of esteem.
So happily come to the issue of mental health later on. I would say, as honourable members will be aware, that PIP is a better benefit for those that have a mental health condition by quite a dramatic degree when you compare the numbers of those with a mental health condition who are on the highest rates of the daily living and the mobility components of PIP compared to DLA. Let me make some progress, but I will come back to mental health. I want to just set out very briefly, with your indulgence, Madam Deputy Speaker, why this agenda is so important to me, and the international agenda in particular. 26 years ago, I worked in the hospitals and orphanages of post-revolutionary Romania in what could only be described as medieval conditions. Most of the children in my care were disabled. All were neglected to the point that some 14-year-olds were still being bottle-fed. Half had HIV. Many had been deliberately infected and medicine withheld to hasten their end. And 50% were babies with a 12% chance of making it to adulthood. Two things stuck out for me from that experience. Firstly, how in the Socialist Republic, villagers who lived only a few hundred metres away from those children could not had no caring thoughts towards them and could not understand why aid workers had come to assist those people in particular. And secondly, that with the exception of the occasional visit from a healthcare professional from one of the Scandinavian nations, all the aid workers were British. And today I am part of a government that has made its international aid efforts prioritised on the 15% of the world's population living with a disability. This is an agenda which is the most under-prioritised and under-resourced in development. We want to establish the UK as a global leader in this field, to build on our experience and our projects in Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, Nepal, Burma, in the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan and elsewhere in the world. In 2014, DFID published the Disability Framework with objectives of ensuring that people with disabilities are systematically included in and benefit from international development and humanitarian assistance. The following year, the framework was revised to include an enhanced focus on economic empowerment, jobs and livelihoods, tackling stigma and discrimination, and expanding the work on mental health. And in addition, DFID is setting out to be a global authority on disability data, and the UK boasts the fact that it is the home also of the Global Disability Innovation Hub. The inquiries that come to me from my opposite numbers around the world are not how to stage the Paralympics, but how to set up welfare systems and how to improve accessibility, employment and representation. And as I turn to the domestic agenda, which the Honourable Lady who secured this debate has focused on, I want to emphasise the reason why I am keen to promote what we are doing, and that is that it is a catalyst to change elsewhere in the world. We have shown what can be done to facilitate disabled access, both physical and service-based, and how it can be achieved in cooperation with business and the third sector. Our work promotes change elsewhere in the world, which is why we would like the UN to recognise what we have been doing. We have already responded to many concerns raised by the UN Committee through our published written response to the list of issues and during a face-to-face dialogue with the UN Committee that oversees the Convention, which is a standard reporting process for all conventions. We were active in promoting the review process with civil society, and we're extremely pleased to note how engaged they were with this process. And I will set out our long-term reporting plans shortly. But the immediate next step will be a response to correct some of the factual inaccuracies in the UN report. In line with the Convention, disability is mainstreamed. Every department is responsible for considering disability in the development and implementation of its policies. This responsibility is made clear through the legislative duties placed on all public bodies via the Public Sector Equality Duty in the Equality Act 2010 and the Northern Ireland Act 1998. As a general principle, we do not incorporate international treaties into domestic law. However, the UK Equality Act 2010 enshrines the right of people in Great Britain with any of 9 protected characteristics to live free from discrimination, harassment or victimisation and have equal opportunities in domestic law. The UK has a long-standing tradition of ensuring that rights and liberties are protected domestically and of fulfilling our international obligations. The decision to leave the European Union does not change this and in fact affords us the opportunity to enhance that agenda. But what is perhaps more important to focus on is how the Equalities Act and other legislation such as the Care Act, for example, are enforced. Honourable members will know that this has been a focus for the Office of Disability Issues under my tenure. And now let me turn to the issues that the Honourable Lady has addressed and the EHRC has also raised. Firstly, that some of the Equality Act provisions applicable to Great Britain are not in force. We do take note of the concerns on these provisions and we are regularly reviewing the scope for introducing further, including the duty to make reasonable adjustments to common parts of rented properties, as the Minister for Equalities promised the Lords Equalities Act and Disability Committee that we would, and we're looking at the implementation of the requirement for political parties to publish diversity data, and we will report back to Parliament in due course on all of those issues. The EHRC also raised the issue of Northern Ireland currently providing weaker protection than other areas in the UK. The Northern Ireland Executive's draft programme for government 2016 to 2021 includes a proposal to amend the Disability Discrimination Act 1995 to increase the level of statutory protection for disabled people, and this remains subject to review and approval of future ministers and the Northern Ireland Assembly, and I hope that that will be something that will be progressed. The EHRC also is calling for a coordinated UK-wide action plan to implement the CRPD, as the Honourable Lady also spoke about in her speech. The Office of Disability Issues is currently reflecting how we take this work forward and are carefully considering our approach, which we will be discussing with stakeholders in due course. But I can give the Honourable Lady assurances that I am keen to use the process that we go through with the UN to help speed up progress on a range of issues, and we will report that in due course. The UK has some of the strongest legislation in the world to protect human rights of disabled people. The current OECD data puts the UK public spending on supporting disability above all bar one G7 country. Disability benefit spending will be higher than in 2010 for every year until 2020 and is currently at a record high. And let me turn to the Honourable Lady's concerns on PIP and in particular mental health, as those were the regulations that she referred to. We will very shortly be responding to Paul Gray's second review into PIP. The House will not have long to wait before we publish that, and as part of that we undertook to look in particular at mental health, in part because of the issues raised in this and the other place on those particular regulations. So if she will bear with me, she will not have long to wait on that. The Department has also been undertaking work on conditionality and sanctions, initially looking at those with a mental health condition, and again we will make announcements on those issues shortly, but I'm not able to do so this evening. We have also been recruiting to set up user rep panels for both ESA and PIP, and I very much agree with what the Honourable Lady says about not just occasionally consulting, but actually embedding the opportunities for disabled people to continually and in real time shape improvements that we want to make to the welfare system and other areas, and also to inform proactively any future reform that we may wish to undertake. Last year we launched the Improving Lives, Work, Health and Disability Green Paper and consultation. With over 6,000 responses, we successfully sparked a national discussion on how better to support people with disabilities and health conditions to get into, stay in and progress through work. And we are carefully considering the responses and our next steps for longer term reform, which we will set out this autumn. And our goal is to get 1 million more disabled people into work, more talent utilised, and to enable more people to reach their full potential. I can tell her that there is no plans to amend minimum wage legislation. We know that although the employment rate for someone with a learning disability is less than 6%, given the right vocational education and independent living support, that can rise to 86%. And that's what we should be concentrating on if we want to assist those people into the workplace. Whether you have a learning disability or not, if you work a day, you should be paid for a day. The issue or particular issues concerning deaf people and hearing impaired people have been raised by a couple of interventions. Their needs in particular have been a focus, especially in the Health and Work Green Paper. The issue of guide dogs was raised, and assistance dogs, as it is Assistance Dog Week and Guide Dog Week. The Office of Disability Issues has been leading a project working with all assistance dog charities, in part with the view to reducing the waiting time that people may face in getting one of these vital assistance dogs, and working with those organisations to agree a national standard to enable them to better use the resources that they have. And with the work that we're doing, in particular with the Joint Health and Work Unit, we're looking again at opportunities where we can ensure that DPOs are absolutely at the heart of shaping, evaluating and setting the agenda on and looking at what kind of, in particular, of employment support that we should provide. We should be providing. So many of the things that we've been doing chime with what the Honourable Lady has on her wish list. But this agenda is much wider than that. In February, my department announced 11 new sector champions who will be helping tackle issues faced by disabled people as consumers. These champions represent a range of sectors and business areas, from banking to aviation to sport to retail. They are using their influence to drive improvements in accessibility and quality of services and facilities within their sector, and I pay tribute to them for their outstanding work. And through initiatives run by the ODI, we are harnessing the power of technology, new opportunities that we have to better enforce the Equality Act and improve accessibility. There is much more I could say on the ODI's and the government's work in tackling hate crime, in building regulations and housing, on provision of critical facilities like Changing Places Lewes, where we're in discussion with DCLG, and on tackling the extra costs of disability, and on changes to education and extending opportunity, and on the additional provisions of the Equality Act that are coming and we wish to bring into force. As we develop our UN reporting process, I hope that further engagement on these issues will be possible with colleagues in this place and the other place. And I hope that the UN will recognise not just the progress that the UK has made and is making, and our ambitions on this agenda, but also our humanitarian desire to help other nations achieve more too. I have seen the difference that the UK makes in many of those projects. It's been my privilege to see that DFID runs, and 26 years earlier in the former Eastern Bloc. The UN's support will not be a necessary condition to our success, but it would be a welcome and a helpful one. Thank you.